Hello and welcome to the Season 2 premiere of The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. Airing every Thursday at 5 p.m. on 91.1 WHSK The Husky. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Thank you. You are very kind. Each semester, I teach a class available in your course catalog as Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, a course that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the good life in the Great Acceleration, a theme that I intend to introduce and explain on the show today. If you've listened to this program in the past, you know that we are formatted just like a standard conversational podcast. I'm the host, we've got new guests each week, and we always talk about some element of contemporary life, a problem that we face, a controversy on which people of good faith might disagree, an idea that might be promising in the future, etc., etc. My guests, who are usually students from the course, tell us about their research questions and their reading. We try to identify the most interesting points and their implications, and the show grows organically in this way. Today's episode is different because it's just me, and I'm trying to set the stage for the episodes to come. To do that, I need to talk a little bit today about the questions that will animate our work this semester. What is a good life? What is the Great Acceleration? And what does it mean to live a good life here and now in the midst of the Great Acceleration? If you're interested in the question of what constitutes a good life, there is a lot out there for you to read. People have been thinking about this and writing about it ever since ancient Rome and ancient Athens, and there's tons of self-help literature on the internet. There's no shortage of material here for you to consider. Today, though, I would just like to situate it amid a few simple binaries, because this is the way that I have thought about the question as long as I've been thinking about it, dating back to when I was, 15 or 16 years old, and first entertained the possibility that I might not live a good life. It seemed possible that I might make bad decisions that led to less happiness and more problems. It seemed possible for the first time that I might reach middle age and have a bunch of regrets. And of course, I wanted to avoid that possibility, and so immediately started to think about my life in a few simple ways. For example, is the good life an individual measure or a collective measure? Is my individual good life my business and my business alone? Or should I think about the good life in terms of the amount of good that I can do for my family, my friends, my neighbors, my community, my country in some way? By that same token, is the good life a private or a public measure? Is it measured in terms of how much wealth and luxury and comfort and freedom I can accumulate for myself and for my family? Or is it manifest in public service, in volunteering, in donation? A lot of our great historical figures are people who are memorable because they did something important for their community or for their country, as opposed just for themselves. We could also think about the good life as a moral measure. For a lot of people, their life is good or bad to the extent that their behavior is good or bad. I can say that my life is good because I conducted myself in accord with the principles handed down to me by my religious tradition, or by my vision of citizenship, or by my philosophy of living, my own personal standard of conduct, or something. We might then also think of the good life as a measure of hedonism. For some people, the good life might be measured in terms of how much pleasure one can accumulate for themselves over the course of their years. In this view, maybe it's about freedom and relaxation. Maybe it's about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I have thought about this question at different points from all of these angles, and ultimately, at this point in my early middle age, I tend to lean a little bit more towards the collective, towards the public, and towards the moral understanding. But I think all of us have to think about this question for ourselves. And of course, I encourage the students in my class to think about it for themselves and to come up with their own answers. Along the way, though, I'd like to argue that the good life is necessarily situated in a time and a place. And so the good life for me here in 2025 in central Pennsylvania is probably somewhat different than it would be if I had been born in 1850 in Concord, Massachusetts, or if I had been born in New York City in the year 2700 or something else. Again, when we look back at famous figures who are recognized for having lived great lives, they are, in almost every case, memorable because they interacted with the events, the problems, the crises, the exigencies of their time and place. They looked around them, saw what was happening, and responded in some historic way. And so for me, that means that all of us living in this time, in this place, if we want to live good lives, we have to look around ourselves and ask what's happening in the world right now, and how ought we to be responding to it. Our second question, therefore, is relevant, and that is, what is the Great Acceleration? In short, the Great Acceleration refers to an 80-year period from the end of World War II in 1945 until the present in 2025. This is a period in which the rapid and widespread increase of human economic activity and correspondent environmental impacts have created the world in which we live today. John McNeill and Peter Engelke have written the definitive book on the matter, appropriately titled The Great Acceleration, and I strongly recommend that you check it out of the Andrus Library. In the book, they document the rapidly accelerating trends that explain this era. So what does it mean? Well, let's consider some examples, and I'll note that these are very graphable. They are much more compelling in graph form, and I'll recommend some readings and place in the show notes on YouTube a few texts that you should consider if you want to understand these numbers a little more clearly and more visually. For example, Homo sapiens have been on this planet for about 200,000 years, scientists tell us, but it took them all the way until the year 1800 to reach a global population of 1 billion people. That's a significant milestone. It then took only another 125 years for that figure to double to 2 billion in 1925. It then took only 50 years for that figure to double again, such that the global population reached 4 billion in the year 1975, and then only another 48 years or so for that figure to double again. And in 2023, we crossed 8 billion people. And so if you look at that in graph form, what you have is a hockey stick. 200,000 years, give or take, in which the line is very low and flat until you get to 1800 when it starts to tick up, and then 1900 when it starts to tick up even more. And then from 1945 or so to the present, it goes basically vertical. And that is really remarkable population growth. The trend holds when we consider economic growth. If you look at global GDP in 1960, you will see that it stands around $1 trillion. By 1980, 20 years later, it had increased 11-fold to $11 trillion. By 2000, it was at 34 trillion, and today in 2025, the figure stands at about $105 trillion globally. That is massive, rapid, exponential economic growth. And it is powered by similar trends in primary energy use. That's because our global economy has been powered primarily by the burning of fossil fuels. In 1800, global primary energy use stood at about 5,000 terawatt hours, which is the metric that they use to measure it. 100 years later, in 1900, it had a little more than doubled to 12,000 terawatt hours. In 1950, it reached 27,000. In 2000, it had jumped all the way to 112,000 terawatt hours, and in 2023, the figure stood at 164,000 terawatt hours and growing. The energy that we consume in order to power our economic growth, in order to accommodate our increasing billions of people, has been growing exponentially since the end of the Second World War. In many ways, these are remarkable figures, and they demonstrate enormous leaps forward in terms of the quality of human life, at least for most people in the developed world. And that's why they define a period that we call the Great Acceleration. But by that same token, they have not come without cost, especially environmental costs. Let's note here that because our primary energy use is powered by the burning of fossil fuels, we have emitted a lot more carbon in the last 80 years than ever before in human history. In the year 1800, human beings worldwide emitted an estimated 33 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. 50 years later, in 1850, that number had shot all the way up to 197 million tons. In 1900, they emitted 1.9 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. By 1950, it was up to 5.9 billion. In 2000, 26 billion. And in 2023, we emitted 38 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And remember, these are annual figures, right? This is not cumulative. This is how much we are emitting every single year. Unsurprisingly then, that carbon dioxide has been accumulating in the atmosphere. In 1900, and for about 800,000 years before that, the carbon concentration of the atmosphere is an estimated 300 parts per million. Or at least according to NASA, in the last 800,000 years, the carbon concentration of the atmosphere, though it did go up and it did go down, has never exceeded 300 parts per million. That was kind of the cap that created a livable world for human beings. By 1960, the figure had started to increase. We reached about 315 parts per million. In 1990, it had jumped all the way up to 353 parts per million. In 2010, 388. And in 2025, we now stand at 425 parts per million in the atmosphere and rising. All those decades of massive carbon emission have led to increasing carbon concentration in our atmosphere, which is why it is not surprising that, as we now know, the global surface temperature has been increasing as well. And the 10 warmest years in recorded history now fall cleanly within the last 10 years. 2023 set a record as the warmest year in human history until that record was broken in 2024 and is likely to be broken again and again and again in the years to come. Now, why is this significant? In our course, we open with a careful consideration of a 2015 article by the late Earth system scientist Steffen and his colleagues, which was published in the Anthropocene Review and is appropriately titled The Trajectory of the Anthropocene, the Great Acceleration. This piece illustrates the economic and Earth system trends side by side through 24 comparable hockey stick graphs that measure the changes between 1750 and 2010. They are striking to look at and very helpful in clarifying just how different these last 80 years have been compared to everything that came before in human history. I think this is all so important to understand because it highlights a major problem in popular opinion about matters like economic growth, environmental damage, and climate change. In the fall of 2023, the last time the Yale Program on Climate Communications surveyed the public, 72% of respondents said that they believed the climate was changing. This is pretty good, I suppose, but it's too low, considering just how conclusive the evidence now is. This is especially problematic given that only 58% of respondents said that they believed climate change was caused by human activity, whatever they imagined that to mean. Once we place these phenomena in the frame of the Great Acceleration, it all becomes much clearer, simpler, and easy to process. In this light, the question of whether human activity, quote unquote, causes climate change amounts to a bit of a head scratcher. The answer is yes, but that's just the beginning. Recognizing this fact and understanding precisely which activity it implies opens the door to a host of far more interesting questions that we miss if we get hung up on the first one. We should not occupy ourselves with a 1995 question when there are now thousands of 2025 questions to consider. Now, the good news is that globally, there are millions and millions of people trying to answer these 2025 questions, trying to find solutions to the problems that we face. They are working in governments, in universities, in private companies, think tanks, NGOs, etc. You wouldn't necessarily know this if you are taking your cues from the American political environment, especially under the Trump administration. The United States has really abdicated its responsibility here to take on a leadership role in addressing these issues. The Biden administration had embraced that role. The Trump administration has abandoned it entirely once again. But in the course, we're not going to get caught up too much in American politics because there's a lot of other interesting things to discuss. In particular, we will direct our attention to a pair of approaches to dealing with the issues associated with the Great Acceleration. The first of these is known as degrowth economics, and it is based primarily in Europe, especially around the University of Barcelona, and some figures who work there, including Giorgos, Kallis, Jason Hickel, others, Mathias, Schmelzer, and others, who have taken this research into the Great Acceleration and have proposed revisions to our economic model that may help us to decelerate some of these trends, and so create a world in which better lives are possible, a world with less economic inequality, with less poverty and suffering, with less economic churn. Degrowth economics is a concerted effort to change our economic model so that we are no longer pursuing endless GDP growth, but rather directing our energy towards what they always call human flourishing, based on a few simple principles. One is that infinite growth is impossible on a finite planet. And when you look at the graphs in the Steffen piece, you see trends that certainly appear to be unsustainable. If we want our economic growth to continue and always to be accelerating at 3%, 4%, 5%, we can't do that without extracting more and more material from nature, without churning out ever greater units for sale, and eventually the earth can no longer sustain this type of activity. And so that principle, infinite growth is impossible on a finite planet, is very basic to degrowth, and I think very intuitive to anyone who is reading this material. Second, they argue that economic growth and environmental damage are necessarily coupled. We cannot continue to push economic growth through the standard means without also necessarily continuing to destroy natural habitats, to emit pollution, to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and so forth. Actually, I think this is one of the most interesting points of dispute in the debate because, as we'll see in a moment, there are those who disagree and who argue that especially economic growth and carbon emissions can and have been decoupled. The question is whether or not that can be kept up over a long period of time. Third, degrowth economists argue that the economic growth of the Great Acceleration has made a few humans very rich and a couple of billion others prosperous, while actively harming several billion more by creating tremendous economic inequality between what we now call the developed world and the developing world. Many of the companies that serve the developed world have long since outsourced their manufacturing to the developed world, where they are able to pay lower wages and treat their employees less generously. It's also the case that most of these countries in the developed world, or many of them, are more susceptible to the impacts of climate change because they're located close to the equator or they're at sea level. A lot of our fast fashion is churned out from Bangladesh, which is among the most vulnerable regions in the whole world for sea level rise, for example. Fourth, degrowth economists argue that lots of people, even in the developed world, remain disappointed, lonely, and unhappy. Even though we enjoy tremendous material comfort, access to clothing, nice accommodations, video games and TV shows and streaming services and all this, we are still experiencing what some have called epidemics of loneliness because our civic institutions have more or less crumbled and we are living more and more atomistic lives, separated from one another, communicating through screens, etc. And in that sense, the unbelievable economic growth that we have enjoyed in recent decades does not seem to have translated into what they call, again, human flourishing, broad-based happiness. There remains a hole in our collective lives that economic growth in itself has been unable to fill. And finally, because perpetual economic growth is impossible, undesirable, unethical, and unfulfilling, a new approach is needed. And that's what they have proposed. If you're interested in the ideas coming out of degrowth economics, I encourage you to consider a few books, and we'll put these in the show notes. The Case for Degrowth by Giorgos Kallis and his colleagues, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World by Jason Hickel, and The Future is Degrowth, A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism by Mathias Schmelzer, Andrea Vetter, and Aaron Van Singen. If you read these books, you'll see that they propose a few basic policy options for converting the economy into something more humane, more equitable, and less environmentally destructive. My main critique of the degrowth economic model is that so far it seems impractical. There's also a question of how we can realistically go about reorienting the entire global economy, especially since some of the most powerful people and corporations in the world would be dead set against it. That said, I do think that part of living a good life is being aspirational towards how life might be improved, and that's what the degrowth literature definitely does. And so I would encourage everyone to take a look at these. People in the class will have an opportunity to check them out for themselves. The other approach to the Great Acceleration that we'll consider this semester is the green growth approach. Unlike degrowth economists, green growth proponents suggest that the economy can be kept basically the way it is, and that we can continue to pursue economic growth while also shifting away from destructive industries into things that are clean, sustainable, renewable, etc. And here, the two books that we'll introduce in the class are Akshat Rathi's Climate Capitalism, Winning the Race to Zero Emissions and Solving the Crisis of Our Age, and Hannah Ritchie's Not the End of the World, How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. Both of these figures argue, contra the degrowth economists, that economic growth and ecological damage can be decoupled. They note, for example, that most of the world's wealthier nations have already achieved this because their economies continue to grow even as their greenhouse gas emissions have flatlined or are in decline. They note that the richer a nation becomes, the more effectively it can decrease emissions and invest in clean tech. And in fact, the big problem that we face right now is not getting the wealthiest nations to cut their emissions, but rather how to help developing nations continue to develop without burning fossil fuels. In fact, the challenge of our time may be how to get China, India, many African nations to improve their standard of living while skipping the coal and oil revolution and going straight to things like solar and wind in order to make it happen. They suggest that large-scale shifts to renewable energy, electric vehicles, and more durable infrastructure require large-scale investment, and that means that given the scope of the problems and the urgency with which we have to address them, we have to use the systems that are in place and draw upon the wealth that they command rather than trying to rebuild the world from the ground up. I think there's a lot compelling in their argument, and I'm excited to put these two approaches into conversation in the class this semester. I'm going to especially recommend this Hannah Ritchie book. I find her to be a fascinating figure. She is the lead researcher at the website Our World in Data, which is a fantastic website, especially if you like graphs. You can spend a lot of time clicking around there and looking at images. But just for example here, the point that she makes that I think is so compelling is that if we want to live good lives in the Great Acceleration, we have to do two things simultaneously. One is we have to slow it down and find ways to take our existing economy and make it greener, cleaner, more sustainable. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we don't lose any of the good things that the Great Acceleration has given to us. And these are many. This is something that I think the degrowth economists might want to acknowledge a little more emphatically than they do. Hannah Ritchie notes, for example, that for every graph that looks like a hockey stick going upward in the degrowth literature. You could also find graphs that look like hockey sticks going down that also deserve our attention. And one of these is the child mortality rate. One of the reasons that our population has increased so dramatically since 1945 is that child mortality rate has collapsed during those same years. The population of the world has not been growing since 1945 because people have been having larger families. In fact, that trend is actually headed in the opposite direction. The population has been growing because more and more children who are born into the world are surviving to adulthood because of advances in medication, in sanitary conditions, in food, water, medicine. Children have become healthier and happier and living longer, and that's a good thing. The same is true of maternal mortality rate. Mothers are surviving childbirth in much greater numbers now than they have been in the past. And this is especially true in countries like India, Afghanistan. Maternal mortality ratio is in steep decline in much of the developing world, and that too is a good thing. Life expectancy has increased dramatically all over the world since the end of World War II. In every single continent, the numbers today are much, much stronger than they were. In most of the world, around 1900, life expectancy was below 40 years. As of 2023, every continent is up over 60 years. Africa is about 63. The Americas and Europe, they're all well up over 70. And so that's an important change that we owe to the Great Acceleration. The share of population living in extreme poverty has collapsed around the world from almost 80% in 1820 down to below 10% in 2020. So these are important shifts. So again, the interesting question going forward, is it possible to maintain the benefits of the Great Acceleration and share these more widely while also minimizing the environmental damage associated with economic growth? How can we get more output from less input with less waste more efficiently? And this, again, is the question that is being addressed by smart people all over the world at this very moment. And so in this context, a good life would be committed, in some measure, to understanding the dynamics that have shaped our present and will shape our future, recognizing the clear threats and obvious benefits that come with living here and now, designing a lifestyle that minimizes harms and optimizes for sustainability, while also volunteering time, money, and energy with organizations that do this work on a larger scale. Personally, I am working with the Citizens Climate Lobby, a Washington, D.C.-based organization that is committed to passing climate-friendly legislation in Congress, especially a carbon fee and dividend. But there are other organizations out there as well that you might want to devote your time and energy to working with, and these would contribute to a better world, while also a better life, a sense of efficacy and civic engagement, a connection to other people working on important problems. I think this is all very vital to living a good life in response to the problems and the exigencies of this particular moment. And so that's what we'll be talking about in class this semester. We will be covering similar topics here on the show. I don't actually know what those are going to be because those are selected by the students themselves. I'm hopeful that you will tune in and follow us along as we explore this fascinating content together. You have been listening to The Art of Conversation Radio here on 91.1 WHSK The Husky. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism here at Commonwealth University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. As always, I am your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you back here next time.